The screaming stopped at exactly 3:47 a.m. on October 13, 1982. But the dogs in Harlan County kept howling until dawn, as if they could sense something sinister that wasn't yet finished. It wasn't the first time silence had fallen like a blade across the Cumberland Mountains, cutting through the night air. This silence, thick with cold dust and the weight of secrets, had been the soundtrack of Copperhead Hollow for decades. The hollows of Kentucky are known for their desolation, but what took place here, hidden deep in these ridges, is the story of a family that time forgot and society dared not acknowledge. For over a century, the Marty family had lived and buried their sins in the shadow of these mountains. Their lives were entangled with the land, and their shadows stretched long across the dark woods. Copperhead Hollow, with its winding gravel roads and rotting porch boards, was a place where no one would go unless they had no choice. The family was isolated, so isolated that even the mailman sometimes forgot their address, and electricity didn't arrive until 1974, though many preferred kerosene lamps for their stubborn pride. The McCretti compound was nestled at the hollow's dead end, where the creek bent sharply around a cluster of trailers and lean-tos. By 1980, 3 generations of the McCretti family lived within shouting distance of one another. Ezekiel McCretti, the patriarch, had 6 children, a growing brood of grandchildren, and a long history that stretched back to the first days of Kentucky's settlement. Their family tree was more like a thorn bush, tangled, dense, and dangerously easy to get caught in. Something was wrong in Copperhead Hollow. Over 3 decades, the strange and horrifying reality of this place would gradually be uncovered. What seemed like a family struggling to survive in isolation was, in truth, a family whose twisted traditions had festered beneath the surface for far too long. The youngest children, with their strange, identical features, and the eerie behavior of the adults, all pointed to something more sinister than poverty or hardship. In September 1981, a social worker named Margaret Finley made the mistake of trying to enroll the McCretti children in school. Her report, dated September 5th, described severe developmental delays, nutritional deficiencies, and children who seemed far too fearful of strangers. These observations should have been a warning to authorities, but the report was buried. Some secrets are better left unexamined, and in Copperhead Hollow, that was a truth that ran as deep as the earth itself. What Margaret Finley couldn't have known was that Copperhead Hollow held a mystery darker than anyone could imagine. What seemed like an isolated family was a small part of a twisted legacy, one that had been hidden in plain sight for generations. To hear more about the terrifying secrets of Copperhead Hollow, subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more chilling stories from the depths of forgotten history. Copperhead Hollow was a place that even the wind seemed to forget. Tucked away between 2 towering ridges in the Appalachian foothills, the hollow stretched like a scar on the face of the land. It was a place where time moved slowly, and people, when they ventured through, often kept their eyes lowered, afraid of what they might see. There was something about the place that made even the most hardened travelers uneasy. The gravel road that led into Copperhead Hollow had been abandoned by the county long ago, left to erode and fade into the earth, as if nature itself was trying to bury it from memory. The hollow was thick with the scent of damp earth, rusted iron, and something faintly metallic that clung to the air. For generations, it had been the home of the McCretti family, whose roots dug deep into the land, far beyond what most could trace. But the land itself, raw, untamed, and unforgiving, had its own presence, as if it too was a silent witness to the McCrettis' strange existence. Every gust of wind through the trees, every creak of the rotting porch boards, every rustle of leaves felt like a whisper from the earth itself, keeping secrets that only the most daring or foolish would try to uncover. The family lived in a world apart. Even the postal worker knew better than to ask too many questions when the McCrettis letters arrived. They were strange people, and the land they lived on was even stranger. Mail would come twice a week, sometimes on time, sometimes not at all, depending on the weather or whether the worker remembered. The McCretti compound, an odd cluster of trailers and shacks, stood at the hollow's dead end, at the bend of a creek that had long since grown murky and slow-moving. This was a place that had been left behind by progress. Electricity didn't arrive until 1974, but even then, Most of the families in the hollow preferred the warm, flickering glow of kerosene lamps, either out of stubborn pride or a deep-rooted tradition that refused to let go of the past. The house that Ezekiel McCretti built for his family sat like a forgotten monument to a different time. It wasn't grand by any means, just a sagging double-wide trailer at the end of the hollow, surrounded by the constant hum of cicadas and the distant calls of the few creatures that managed to survive in such isolation. By 1980, Ezekiel's 6 children, their spouses, and a growing number of grandchildren filled the compound, living side by side in what appeared to be a self-contained world. The family was a tangled web of bloodlines that blurred together in ways that were as disturbing as they were unspoken. The McCretti family was known to those who lived nearby, though not much was ever said. People knew better than to pry. The hollows were a place where the law rarely reached, and the families who lived there had their own ways of doing things. Everyone knew the McCrettis were poor, but poverty wasn't the most disturbing thing about them. It was the strange, unsettling atmosphere that clung to their compound. It was the way the animals in the area seemed to avoid the property, sensing something that no one could quite explain. It was the way the creek that ran by the McCretti compound started running strangely, thick with sediment that didn't match the geology of the surrounding area. Copperhead Hollow wasn't just a place of isolation. It was a place where something had festered, quietly growing in the shadows for years. It was a place where a family, raised in the depths of seclusion, had slowly descended into a world of its own making, where the rules of civilization no longer applied. At night, the sounds from the McCretti compound would drift through the trees, strange, unsettling noises that seemed to come from no identifiable source. The wind would sometimes carry whispers, voices so faint that one could only catch fragments of words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a language that didn't belong to any known dialect. And the silence that followed was the worst part. Silent as the grave, like the land itself had swallowed up everything that happened behind the rusted trailers and broken fences. In the nearby town, people would talk in hushed tones about the McCrettis. They'd say things like, "They've been living like that for years." But they didn't really know. No one knew for sure. The family's peculiar ways, their reclusive nature, and the strange behavior of their children were all swept under the rug. After all, it wasn't anyone's business. But in Copperhead Hollow, there were no outsiders, just an isolated family living in their own twisted version of the world. And as strange as it was, Copperhead Hollow was a place where some silences were best left undisturbed. But that would all change one fateful night in 1982, when the quiet was finally broken, and the secrets that had been buried for decades would rise to the surface. The McCretti family had always been a mystery to the outside world. No one knew where they came from, or how they had managed to survive for so long in Copperhead Hollow, a place so remote that the rest of the world barely knew it existed. But what was known about them was enough to make even the most curious outsiders hesitate before venturing too close. At the center of it all stood Ezekiel McCretti, the patriarch. He was a tall, imposing figure, his face weathered by years of hard living in the mountains. His eyes, though, were the most unsettling part of him, cold, distant, and always watching. Ezekiel had lived through a lifetime of hardship, and it had hardened him into someone who saw the world in very different terms than most. The McCretti family was his kingdom, and the hollow was his domain. As far as Ezekiel was concerned, the rest of the world could burn if it didn't understand the rules of his isolated life. Ezekiel's 6 children, all born in the hollow, had grown up with a set of rules that had no place in the outside world. The oldest son, Isaiah, had inherited his father's stoic nature. He was the most outwardly normal of the family, a man of few words and even fewer emotions. Isaiah kept to himself, working the land with the same quiet determination that his father had passed down to him. But beneath his calm exterior, there was something just as strange as the rest of the family. A deep, unsettling silence that suggested he knew things no one should ever know. Then there was Ruth, the only daughter among the siblings. Ruth had a strange allure to her, a way of moving that was both graceful and unsettling. There was something in her eyes, an intensity that seemed to pierce through people. She had an uncanny ability to make others feel as though they were the ones being watched. Ruth kept a close relationship with her father, often seen sitting next to him at the head of the table during the family's meals, her eyes never straying far from his. She had inherited her father's authority, a cold, almost unnatural command over the younger children. The youngest children of the McCretti clan were the most disturbing. They had been born into a world that was completely foreign to most. Raised in isolation, they had never seen a school, never interacted with other children, and never learned what it meant to have a normal, healthy childhood. They were wild, feral even, their senses honed to a degree that made them seem almost inhuman. Their movements were fluid, silent, and unerringly coordinated. It was as if they had been trained to move with the precision of predators. Daniel, the youngest of Ezekiel's children, was a case study in the strange, twisted nature of the family. He moved like a shadow, often lurking in the background, watching others with an intensity that made people uncomfortable. His hair was wild, and his clothes hung off his skinny frame, a sign of the neglect that had marked the family's way of life. But despite his appearance, there was something about Daniel that felt calculating. His eyes always seemed to be measuring the people around him, taking stock of their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. The rest of the younger McCretti children were just as unsettling. Their faces were often hard to read, expressions frozen in a way that made it impossible to tell what they were thinking. They had grown up without the influence of any outside world, and it showed. They didn't laugh like normal children. They didn't play like normal children. Instead, they moved in eerie synchrony, as if they were part of a larger, more dangerous plan that no one outside the family could comprehend. There was no denying that something was terribly wrong with the McCretti family. But what was even more unsettling was how they had managed to survive for so long without anyone questioning their existence. The small, isolated community surrounding Copperhead Hollow had always been tight-knit, but they were also willing to overlook the strange happenings at the McCretti compound. After all, the McCrettis kept to themselves, and their oddities were just seen as part of life in the mountains. But the more Margaret Finley, the social worker, observed the family, the more it became clear that there was something deeply, fundamentally wrong. The children, especially, seemed to be living in a world of their own, a world that didn't follow the rules of normal society. They didn't speak to outsiders unless absolutely necessary, and when they did, their words came out in a strange, guttural dialect that was almost impossible to understand. It was as if the family had developed their own language, their own set of rules for communication, separate from the rest of the world. It was these signs, small but undeniable, that made Margaret Finley's report such a damning document. The children were not just isolated, they were developing in ways that no child should ever have to. Their minds, shaped by years of neglect and confinement, were evolving into something dangerous, something that no one could have predicted. The McCretti family wasn't just strange. They were a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode in ways no one could foresee. And while the world outside Copperhead Hollow continued on as usual, the McCrettis were preparing for something far more sinister, something that would change everything. In the quiet mountains of Appalachia, people had a way of looking the other way. They turned a blind eye to things they didn't understand, and the McCretti family was a prime example of this unspoken rule. The family's strange behavior was no secret to anyone living nearby, but it was also nothing anyone wanted to get involved in. The McCrettis kept to themselves, and that was all anyone needed to know. But one woman, a social worker named Margaret Finley, would make the mistake of taking a closer look. Margaret had been assigned to the McCretti family to help enroll their children in school. It was a routine task for the state, part of a larger effort to ensure that every child received an education. But when she arrived at the McCretti compound, Margaret found herself facing something far beyond the usual difficulties of working with an isolated family. At first, Margaret noticed the children's strange behaviors. They were far older than their appearance suggested, their bodies stunted by malnutrition and neglect. The youngest, who should have been full of energy and curiosity, seemed unnaturally quiet, too fearful to speak when spoken to. The older children, though they were listed as cousins, bore striking similarities in their facial features, something that unsettled Margaret further. There was no denying it, they were too similar to be just cousins. The children seemed to shrink away from Margaret whenever she tried to engage with them, as if they had never encountered an adult outside their family unit. Their eyes were wide and suspicious, tracking her every movement, but not in the way children usually did. It was as if they had learned early on that trusting outsiders could bring only pain. But it wasn't just the children's behavior that struck Margaret as unusual. It was also the way the family lived. The McCrettis had no running water, no electricity for much of their lives, and their home was nothing more than a cluster of dilapidated trailers that sagged under the weight of time. Yet they didn't seem to care about the harshness of their existence. They had lived this way for decades, accepting their isolation as the only way of life they had ever known. Margaret's report, dated September 5, 1981, was a sobering account of what she had observed. She described the severe developmental delays she had noticed in several of the children, most notably in their lack of social skills and their unnatural fear of outsiders. The younger children, in particular, appeared to be unnaturally afraid of adults who weren't part of their family. Their fearful expressions and the way they clung to their parents suggested a deep-rooted terror that went beyond simple shyness or insecurity. But it wasn't just the children's behavior that troubled Margaret. What disturbed her most was the family's refusal to acknowledge her presence or answer her questions directly. The adults, Ezekiel and his children, were polite enough but distant, unwilling to provide much in the way of information. Ezekiel's response to the idea of sending the children to school was one of disinterest, his eyes never quite meeting hers. It was as if he didn't care what the outside world thought of his family, and in a way he was right. No one had ever tried to change their way of life. Margaret noted that several children appeared to share identical facial features, despite being listed as cousins rather than siblings. This was a detail that she couldn't ignore. It was as if the family had been interbreeding for generations, a fact that raised serious questions about the McCretti family's genetics and its impact on the children's health. But what really stood out to Margaret was the atmosphere of fear that seemed to hang over the entire family. She observed that the children were not only afraid of outsiders but also terrified of their own family members. There was something deeply unsettling about the way they looked at their father, Ezekiel. The older children, especially, seemed to keep their heads down and avoid his gaze whenever possible. When Margaret tried to enroll the children in school, she encountered resistance. The McCrettis didn't want their children to be exposed to the outside world, and they had a strange way of making that clear without ever explicitly saying it. The children's fear of strangers wasn't just a personal quirk. It was a systemic trait cultivated over years of isolation and controlled living. Margaret's report, though filled with damning observations, was quickly buried by her supervisor. The supervisor dismissed the concerns, citing that the McCretti family had their ways, and that it wasn't worth raising a fuss about. After all, they weren't bothering anyone, and they kept to themselves. But the truth was, no one in the county was willing to confront the dark undercurrents of life in Copperhead Hollow. The McCrettis weren't just another isolated family. They were a family that had long since crossed the line between survival and something far more sinister. The eerie silence of Copperhead Hollow wasn't just a result of the McCretti family's isolation. There were other signs, strange, unsettling signs, that something far more sinister was growing in the dark. The land itself seemed to reflect the twisted reality of the family living upon it. And as the years went by, the warnings grew harder to ignore. Hunters, the few who dared venture near the hollow, began to report strange occurrences. For generations, Copperhead Hollow had been a haven for wildlife. The dense woods and winding trails made it a prime location for hunters to stalk game, but something was changing. The game trails that once crisscrossed the McCretti property began to shift, as if the animals had learned to avoid the area entirely. For the first time in years, hunters noticed that the wildlife in the region was disappearing. Deer, rabbits, and wild turkeys, which were typically abundant, seemed to be vanishing from the area, unwilling to set foot near the McCretti compound. At first, it was easy to dismiss this as a natural fluctuation. Perhaps there was a new predator in the area, or maybe a seasonal shift had caused the animals to migrate elsewhere. But the longer the pattern continued, the more concerning it became. It wasn't just that the animals were avoiding the McCretti land. It was the reason behind their avoidance. It was as if the creatures could sense a predator, something far more dangerous than the typical threats they faced in the wild. The creek that ran near the compound, once crystal clear and full of life, began to show disturbing signs of change. At first, it was just a small shift. The water turned a shade murky, and the banks became littered with strange sediment that didn't belong. Over time, the creek grew even more tainted. The muddy water took on an almost blackish hue, as if something had contaminated it, though no one could explain what. The change wasn't natural. It wasn't just the creek being altered by the seasons. It was as if the land itself was being poisoned, but in a way that no one could pinpoint. Neighbors began to talk. They spoke in whispers about how their dogs would bark furiously when they passed the McCretti property, as if something was lurking there, hidden in the shadows. Farmers and landowners from neighboring areas mentioned that their animals would grow uneasy as they neared the boundary of McCretti land. The air, thick with humidity and the scent of the forest, seemed to carry an almost chemical tang when it came from the direction of the compound. It was an unfamiliar, unsettling smell, too metallic, too artificial. Perhaps the most disturbing sign was the behavior of the McCretti children themselves. By 1982, the youngest children had begun to stay close to home, avoiding the woods altogether. They no longer played in the open fields or wandered down by the creek as they once had. The older children, those who had once ventured into town to trade pelts for supplies, were now seen less frequently. When they did appear, they moved with a strange, suspicious quiet, as though every step was calculated. Their eyes rarely met those of the townsfolk, and when they spoke, their voices were low and difficult to understand, muffled by the thick dialect they spoke, one that was becoming increasingly difficult to decipher. The store clerks who once interacted with them at the general store were now growing uneasy. The McCretti children didn't seem to be looking for anything in particular. They didn't smile, didn't engage in the usual chatter that came with small-town visits. Instead, they would hand over a few jars of moonshine or bags of pelts in exchange for supplies, then leave as quickly as they came, their eyes darting nervously around the store. It was clear that the isolation of Copperhead Hollow had warped them in ways that went far beyond what anyone could explain. For years, these signs had gone unnoticed or were quietly dismissed. The people of the surrounding towns had long been accustomed to the McCretti family's peculiar ways. It was just part of life in the Appalachian Mountains, they reasoned. Mountain folk had their ways, and who were outsiders to judge? But as the unsettling signs piled up, the truth became undeniable. Something was growing in the dark, something far beyond the strange behavior of an isolated family. The McCretti children, once seen as just eccentric, were now behaving like feral creatures, and the land itself seemed to be warped by the family's presence. The town had ignored the warnings for too long, but now it was clear. The Hollow held more than just a family. It was hiding a legacy of horror, a deep and twisted secret that was only beginning to surface. In the fall of 1982, the McCretti family's isolation would be shattered by a single decision, one that would forever alter the course of the investigation into the strange happenings at Copperhead Hollow. That decision came from Deputy Michael Torres, a man with years of experience working in the Kentucky mountains. But nothing in his career had prepared him for what he was about to discover. The first call came in late one night, after several neighbors had reported hearing gunshots coming from the direction of the McCretti property. It wasn't an unusual occurrence in the mountains, where hunters often fired their weapons into the woods. But this time, there was a strange urgency to the reports. The shots weren't the usual distant sounds of hunting. They were too close, too loud, and they had been followed by an eerie silence that stretched on for hours. Torres had dealt with plenty of mountain families over the years, people who lived off the land, working in ways that didn't always follow conventional rules. But when he received the call, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the McCretti family. The reports from neighbors, combined with the strange behavior of the children and the family's reluctance to engage with outsiders, had planted seeds of doubt in his mind. As he made his way down the winding mountain roads toward Copperhead Hollow, the air grew heavy with the kind of thick silence that only the Appalachian night could bring. The further he drove, the more isolated he became. The wind whistled through the trees, but everything else seemed unnaturally still. Even the dogs, who usually barked furiously at any approaching vehicle, remained silent tonight. The only sounds that accompanied his patrol car were the soft crunch of gravel beneath his tires and the occasional creak of the trees bending under the weight of the wind. When Torres arrived at the McCretti compound, he immediately felt something wasn't right. The trailers that made up the family's home were eerily still, the dim glow of a single kerosene lamp flickering through a crack in one of the windows. No one had come to greet him, no sign of life except for the faint glow from inside. He stepped out of his patrol car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the main trailer. The air around him felt thick with tension, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. His flashlight cut through the darkness, its beam landing on the sagging roof of the trailer and the rusted-out truck that sat nearby, half buried in dirt and weeds. He paused for a moment, scanning the surroundings. Everything about the place felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on why. As Torres approached the door, he noticed something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. From the shadows of the porch, 3 children emerged, their figures emerging out of the darkness like ghosts, moving with unnatural speed. Torres instinctively reached for his service weapon, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the holster as he prepared for whatever might come next. The children, 2 boys and a girl, stood in front of him, their clothes tattered and their eyes locked on him with an unsettling intensity. Their faces were difficult to read, their features shadowed by the dim light. They didn't speak immediately, just stood there, their eyes tracking his every movement. Torres could sense that they were watching him not as children would, but as something much older, something far more calculating. The girl, who appeared to be around 12, finally broke the silence, her voice thick with a strange, guttural dialect. "Ain't supposed to be here after dark," she said, her words carrying a weight that seemed to belong to someone far older. "Granddaddy don't like strangers." Torres introduced himself, explaining that he had come in response to reports of gunfire. He didn't expect the children to be particularly helpful, but they were strangely cooperative. The girl nodded slightly and then tilted her head toward the largest trailer, the one at the far end of the compound. "Granddaddy's inside," she said, her voice eerily calm. As Torres made his way toward the trailer, he could feel the eyes of the children on him, their gazes never leaving his back. He knocked on the door, and the silence inside was immediately replaced by the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though the person on the other side knew exactly who was coming. When the door finally creaked open, Torres found himself face to face with Ezekiel McCretti, the patriarch of the family. Ezekiel's face was hard and weathered, his skin drawn tight over sharp features. His eyes, though, were the most unsettling, cold, unblinking, and devoid of any warmth. His lips curled into a thin, almost predatory smile. "Evening, Deputy," he said in a voice that was deep and rough, as if it hadn't been used much in years. "Bit late for social calls, ain't it?" Behind him, Torres could see into the dimly lit room. A long table stretched across the space, set with what looked like a feast, steaming dishes filled with meat and food, though the smell in the air made Torres's stomach churn. Something about the scene felt wrong. The proportions were off, as if the food didn't match the number of people present. There were too many faces, too many eyes watching him from around the table. And they weren't just looking, they were studying him. Torres, his hand now resting on his service weapon, knew that he had to be cautious. He wasn't sure what he was dealing with here, but it wasn't just a simple family living in poverty. There was something far darker beneath the surface. He managed to ask, just checking on reports of gunshots, "Is everyone here safe?" Ezekiel's grin widened, his filed teeth catching the light as he replied, "Safe as houses, Deputy. Just doing a little night hunting. These mountains, they're full of things that only come out after dark." Torres felt a chill creep down his spine. He had seen enough strange things in his years on the force to know that something was terribly wrong here. But just how wrong? He wasn't sure yet. Before he could press further, his radio crackled, and he glanced back at his patrol car. His backup hadn't arrived yet, and Torres could feel a sense of growing urgency. He wasn't just dealing with an isolated family. He was standing on the edge of something much bigger and much more terrifying than he had ever imagined. Deputy Michael Torres had no idea just how deep the McCretti family's twisted secrets ran. What began as a routine check of gunshots had escalated into something far darker. As he walked through the worn, creaking halls of the McCretti compound, the sense of dread that had been simmering in his chest grew stronger. There was something off about the place, something that couldn't be explained away by poverty, isolation, or even the strange behavior of the children. When Torres stepped into the main trailer, the heavy door groaned as it opened, revealing a long, dimly lit room. The faint scent of cooked meat hung in the air, and the sizzling sounds from a nearby stove made it clear that a meal was being prepared. But something wasn't right. The proportions of the meal seemed off, far too much food for the small group of people present. As Torres' eyes scanned the room, he saw 7 adults sitting around the table, their faces blank and expressionless, as if they were mere mannequins frozen mid-motion. The atmosphere was unsettling. The flickering light from the kerosene lamps cast long, exaggerated shadows on the walls, creating a sense of unease that Torres couldn't shake. The food on the table looked like it belonged to a feast, but there was something disturbing about it. It wasn't just the smell. It was the way the adults seemed to ignore him, their eyes only occasionally flicking up to meet his. But it wasn't the adults who unsettled Torres the most. It was the children. They were standing in the corners of the room, watching with an intensity that made Torres feel like a prey animal being sized up. The oldest child, a girl no older than 12, stood just behind Ezekiel McCretti, her eyes fixed on the deputy. Her matted blonde hair hung around her face, but it was her eyes, wild, feral, that sent a chill down his spine. She didn't look like a child. She looked like a predator. As Torres took a step forward, the door behind him slammed shut, causing him to turn quickly, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. But he hesitated. This wasn't the time to draw his gun. Not yet. Not with so many eyes watching him. He took a deep breath and steadied his nerves. He needed to understand what he was dealing with, but there was no way he could have prepared for what lay ahead. The conversation stopped immediately. The McCretti family seemed to freeze, their eyes tracking every movement of the deputy. Torres could feel their focus on him, almost as if they were waiting for something. The tension was palpable. Ezekiel's voice broke the silence. "We don't get many visitors," he said, his grin widening. "And it's late. You sure you want to be here?" Torres didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of what had been happening behind these walls. He needed to know, needed to understand what had led to this moment. As his gaze settled on the table, he saw something that made his stomach churn. There were bones visible beneath the surface of the food. Human bones, picked clean, lying half-buried under plates of meat. It was a grotesque sight, one that was impossible to ignore. It felt like a twisted mockery of a family meal. His mind raced. The missing children, the strange disappearances. It all started to make sense. "This isn't just about survival, is it?" Torres asked, his voice tight. "This isn't just about living off the land. This is something else." Ezekiel chuckled softly, his smile widening to reveal teeth that had been filed to points. Sharp, jagged, and unnatural. "No," Ezekiel replied, his voice as cold as the winter air outside. "It's not about survival. It's about feeding. About doing what nature intended. The strong eat the weak, deputy. Always has. Always will." Torres felt the blood drain from his face as he realized what Ezekiel was implying. This family, isolated for so long, had twisted the concept of survival into something monstrous. They weren't just living off the land, they were hunting it. They had been hunting people. The children began to move, stepping out of the shadows and into the dim light. Their movements were silent, almost predatory, like creatures stalking their prey. As they gathered around Torres, he could feel their eyes on him, calculating, watching for any weakness. The oldest girl with the matted blonde hair stepped forward, her eyes locked on his. "We take what we need," she said, her voice like a whisper. "And we keep it in the family. No one ever goes hungry here. Not ever." Torres' heart pounded in his chest. The weight of the situation was starting to settle in, and he could feel the walls closing in around him. He had to get out. He had to warn someone, but it felt like the walls of the hollow were closing in on him too. The smell in the room had become overpowering, the metallic tang of blood mixing with the rancid odor of old meat. Torres could feel the sweat forming on his brow, his fingers twitching toward his holster. But just as he moved, he caught sight of something that made his stomach turn. In the corner of the room, partially hidden beneath a ragged blanket, was a small, rusted bicycle. Its purple frame and the silver streamers attached to the handlebars were unmistakable. It was the bicycle of Amy Chen, a 7-year-old girl who had gone missing during a camping trip near Pine Mountain State Park 6 months earlier. Torres recognized it immediately, his breath catching in his throat. That was the moment he realized just how far this family's depravity stretched. They weren't just living off the land, they were systematically hunting people. And Amy Chen was only the beginning. Torres' pulse quickened as he glanced back at the McCretti family. The children had stopped moving now, their eyes locked on him with an intensity that made him feel like a trapped animal. Ezekiel stood calmly, watching as Torres processed the horror unfolding before him. "This isn't over," Torres muttered to himself, backing toward the door. "You're not getting away with this." But as he reached for the door, he heard something that made him freeze in place. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, light, quick, and inhumanly silent, moved behind him, as if the children had already begun to circle their prey. Deputy Michael Torres had seen a lot in his career, but nothing like this. Standing in the dimly lit trailer, surrounded by the silent, calculating eyes of the McCretti family, he knew he was facing something far beyond the realm of his training. There were no standard procedures for what he was dealing with, no manual for how to confront the monstrous reality that had been hidden in Copperhead Hollow for decades. As the McCretti children circled him, their eyes never leaving him for a second, Torres felt the weight of his badge pressing down on him. His first instinct was to draw his weapon, to assert his authority and bring order to this terrifying situation. But something in the way the McCretti family moved, in the way their eyes gleamed with a predatory focus, told him that he wasn't dealing with ordinary criminals. This wasn't a robbery, a domestic dispute, or even a drug bust. This was something darker, something primal. They were hunters, and he was the prey. Torres had been a lawman long enough to know that his survival was the top priority. He had been trained to deal with dangerous criminals, to face down violence and chaos. But this was something that transcended the laws he had sworn to uphold. The McCrettis didn't operate by any rules, not the rules of society, not even the laws of nature. They had created their own twisted code, one that was as alien to him as the distant stars. He knew instinctively that there was no reasoning with them, no authority he could exert that would make them stop. He could feel the weight of his weapon at his side, but he couldn't bring himself to draw it. There was a growing dread in his chest, a feeling that any movement he made could provoke them into attacking. The way they looked at him, so calculating, so inhuman, made him feel like he was being studied, as if they were analyzing his every action for weaknesses. The oldest McCretti girl, the one with the matted hair and feral eyes, stepped forward. Her voice was soft, almost sweet, a voice that belied the deadly intent behind it. "Granddaddy says it's rude to leave without saying goodbye," she said, her words heavy with a meaning that Torres could only begin to comprehend. His heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to get out, to run. But the air around him seemed to close in, the walls of the trailer pressing closer with each passing second. He couldn't afford to show fear, not now, not when his every move could determine his survival. Torres took a slow, measured breath. He had to make a choice: stay and confront them or escape and live to tell the tale. It was a decision he had never expected to face. His duty was to protect and serve, to uphold the law. But the law didn't apply here. In Copperhead Hollow, there were no rules. There was only survival. The moral dilemma gnawed at him. He had been raised to believe that justice would always prevail, that the law was a shield to protect the innocent. But in this place, justice was as warped and twisted as the land itself. The McCretti family had never known the law. They had their own laws, passed down through generations of darkness, isolation, and predation. For the first time in his life, Torres had to ask himself, was it worth dying to uphold the law? Or was it more important to live, to survive, and warn the world about the horrors that had festered here for so long? He glanced at the children, their eyes still locked on him, their movements so synchronized, so deliberate. They were predators born and bred to hunt. And in that moment, Torres realized that he was just another victim, another piece in their sickening game. Torres made his choice. Without a word, he turned on his heel and bolted toward the door, his heart racing. The children's eyes tracked him, their faces unchanging, but the sense of danger in the air intensified as he reached the threshold. He could feel them closing in on him, but he wasn't ready to die just yet. Not here, not like this. His boots hit the ground outside, and for a split second, the world felt like it had opened up again. He could hear the wind in the trees, the soft rustling of leaves, the faintest hint of the night air. But he knew it wouldn't last. The McCrettis were right behind him, closing in with the precision of predators on the hunt. Torres didn't look back. He ran, his boots pounding on the gravel road, heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the cold weight of fear settle in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. The only thing that mattered now was getting out of the hollow and warning anyone who would listen. As he ran, he could hear the chatter of the children behind him, soft, almost sing-song, their voices carrying the same eerie, unholy rhythm that made his blood run cold. They were after him. They were hunting him, and they wouldn't stop until they had him. But Torres wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. He had made his choice, and he would fight for his survival with every breath in his body. He wouldn't die in Copperhead Hollow, not today. Deputy Michael Torres had made the decision to run, but he soon realized that escaping the McCretti compound wasn't going to be as simple as running down a dirt road. As he sprinted through the gravel yard, his boots pounding the earth with each frantic step, the air around him felt thick with tension. He could hear them behind him, the McCretti children, their movements synchronized, as if they had been trained for this. They were silent, their steps barely a whisper against the ground, yet their presence loomed over him like a dark cloud. Torres pushed himself harder, his heart pounding in his chest, but the fear was rising in him, tightening around his throat like a vice. It wasn't just that the children were close. It was the way they moved with such eerie precision. He could hear their breathing, soft and almost inhuman, as they closed the distance between them. They weren't running, they were stalking him, waiting for him to make a mistake. In the distance, Torres saw the faint lights of his patrol car, still parked at the edge of the property. But the gravel road that separated him from safety seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, winding through the dark, shadow-filled trees. He knew he wouldn't make it there in time. The children were too fast, too coordinated. They were on him already, closing in, moving like shadows that blended seamlessly with the night. Torres' mind raced as he tried to calculate his next move. His patrol car was still his only chance for escape, but the road to it was long and treacherous. The children, no longer just children but something far more dangerous, were already tracking him, and their movements were deliberate, calculated. They weren't just following him, they were surrounding him, cutting off every escape route. A low, hissing sound filled the air, and Torres froze for a split second. He recognized it immediately. Whistles, soft at first, then louder, more urgent. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was the McCretti children, communicating in a language he couldn't understand. But the meaning was clear. They were closing in, ready to pounce. He could feel them now, their eyes burning into his back, their every movement predatory. He had been trained to handle violent criminals, but nothing in his career had prepared him for this. Feral children, raised to be nothing more than hunters, stalking their prey with terrifying precision. Torres' pulse quickened as he realized that his training was useless here. These weren't ordinary people. This was a family, a tribe whose very survival depended on hunting and killing, and the law didn't apply to them. Nothing applied to them. Torres' legs screamed in protest as he pushed himself harder, his lungs burning for air, but he couldn't stop now. His only chance was to reach the patrol car, to get out of this nightmare before they caught him. But the further he ran, the more he realized that the land itself seemed to conspire against him. The road, which had seemed like an easy escape, now felt like it was stretching on forever, the shadows of the trees closing in around him. He glanced over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of one of the McCretti children. A young boy, no older than 8 or 9, but moving with the ferocity of a grown predator. His eyes were locked on Torres, wide with excitement. His face twisted into a grin that sent a cold shiver down the deputy's spine. There was no fear in the boy's gaze, only hunger. The noise around him intensified, whistles grew sharper, more insistent. He knew they were closing in. The children had become a hunting pack, and he was the prey. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. There was no way he was going to make it to his patrol car. He had to change direction. Torres veered sharply to the left, darting between the trees, hoping to lose them in the dense forest. But it was a futile attempt. The McCretti children were too well trained, too in tune with the land. They knew every rock, every tree, every shadow. Torres had always thought of himself as a seasoned lawman, but now, in the darkness of Copperhead Hollow, he felt like a rookie, out of his depth and outmatched. Suddenly, a sharp cry rang out from behind him. It was a sound that made his blood run cold. It wasn't a child's scream. It was the call of a predator, the signal to the others that the chase was nearly over. Torres' heart skipped a beat. He had been cornered. They were circling him now. His legs began to feel like lead, his feet heavy and slow. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, feet pounding the earth, the eerie whispers of the children's voices echoing through the trees, their words unintelligible but full of predatory intent. They were getting closer, and Torres knew he had no chance of outrunning them. His only hope was to hide, to find somewhere, anywhere, to escape their gaze. As he sprinted through the trees, he spotted a small depression in the ground, barely noticeable in the dim light. Without thinking, he dropped to the ground, crawling into the hollow, hoping that the shadows would hide him long enough for the children to pass. His breath was coming in short, ragged bursts, and his pulse thudded in his ears like a drumbeat. But he fought to remain still, to remain silent. Through the branches above, Torres could see the movement of the McCretti children. They were moving past him now, their eyes scanning the area. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't find him. Their voices, low and calm, whispered in the darkness as they passed by. The hunt was still on, but for a brief moment, Torres had escaped their immediate grasp. He knew, however, that it wasn't over. The McCretti children had hunted before, and they would find him eventually. This wasn't a game. This was a hunt that had been going on for generations, and he was now the prey. Torres' only chance was to find a way out, before they closed in for the kill. The storm of terror that had unfolded in Copperhead Hollow was far from over. Deputy Michael Torres had narrowly escaped the clutches of the McCretti family, but the darkness he had uncovered was only the beginning. It wasn't just one family. It was an entire network, a web of twisted individuals connected by blood, silence, and a shared history of unspeakable acts. And now, as the daylight finally broke over the mountains, the investigation was about to take a much darker turn. The Kentucky State Police, alongside federal agents, had been alerted to the horrors that Torres had uncovered in the McCretti compound. What began as a routine investigation had now turned into one of the most shocking cases of systematic predation ever discovered in the United States. By the time backup arrived, it was clear. This was no ordinary case of poverty-stricken isolation. It was a sophisticated, deeply rooted system of cannibalism that had festered in the shadows for generations. The raid on the McCretti compound came swiftly, as agents surrounded the area, cutting off any possible escape routes for the family. The McCretti patriarch, Ezekiel McCretti, was arrested without resistance. His calm demeanor, even in the face of being apprehended, was unnerving. It was as if he had been expecting this moment for years, knowing that it was only a matter of time before his twisted empire crumbled. But it wasn't just Ezekiel who was taken into custody. Ruth, the oldest daughter, and Isaiah, the oldest son, were also arrested, though they showed little emotion as they were led away in handcuffs. The rest of the family, the children who had been raised in the suffocating darkness of Copperhead Hollow, were taken into protective custody, their lives shattered in an instant. Many of them had never seen the outside world, never experienced the kind of freedom that most children took for granted. The true scale of the horror began to unfold as investigators entered the McCretti home. What they discovered inside was a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. In the underground tunnels beneath the compound, they found evidence of a long history of child abductions, murder, and cannibalism. Personal belongings from at least 15 missing children were found scattered throughout the tunnels, along with crude drawings that detailed the family's hunting methods and techniques. It was as if the McCrettis had documented their twisted practices like a family history, passing down knowledge from one generation to the next. Torres, still reeling from the events that had transpired, was called in to help with the raid. His heart sank as he walked through the tunnels. The remnants of the McCretti family's atrocities laid bare before him. The walls were lined with scratched names and dates, a grim ledger of the lives the family had taken. Each name was a story, a child who had been lured away, kept, and ultimately killed for reasons that would never be fully understood. The bicycle Torres had seen earlier, the one belonging to Amy Chun, was just one of the many disturbing pieces of evidence that tied the McCrettis to a string of disappearances that stretched back decades. The local community, which had long known of the McCretti family's reclusive nature, was rocked by the revelation of what had been happening right under their noses. Neighbors and townsfolk who had once offered casual greetings to the McCrettis now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about the family. How could such horrors have gone unnoticed for so long? How had the McCrettis managed to maintain their twisted existence in such close proximity to the rest of society? The raid also revealed the true horror of the McCretti family's lifestyle. It wasn't just about survival, it was about control, power, and satisfaction of a need so primal that it had become ingrained in their very bloodline. The McCrettis had hunted people just as they had hunted animals, and they had done so for generations. What had begun as a desperate survival tactic had evolved into a carefully structured lifestyle that had lasted over a century. For Torres, the raid was a moment of both relief and disillusionment. The family was finally exposed, but the scars left behind by their actions would never heal. The children, rescued from the clutches of their twisted upbringing, were placed in protective care, but they were not without damage. They had been raised to see the world through the eyes of predators, and now they had to learn what it meant to be part of a civilized society. As Torres walked away from the McCretti compound, his mind was heavy with the weight of what had been uncovered. The horrors he had witnessed would stay with him forever, but there was also a sense of closure, a feeling that the family's reign of terror had finally come to an end. Yet, deep in his gut, there was a nagging feeling, a sense that this case was not the end of something, but the beginning. Operation Mountain Sweep had uncovered the McCretti family, but it had also uncovered something much darker, a network of similar families, operating in the shadows across the Appalachian region. The McCrettis were not alone. They were just the most visible of a larger, more sinister force that had been operating in secret for generations. Torres knew that the investigation would continue, but he also knew that the true scope of the horror was still unfolding. For now, the McCretti compound had been dismantled, and the family's twisted legacy was exposed. But in the back of Torres' mind, the question remained: how many more families were out there, living in the darkness, waiting to be discovered?